quite exciting when someone else is managing the live stream. You see the tension in his face.
It's relaxing to see it.
Whereas for me, it's very relaxing these days. Right, welcome to Neuroccino on this Monday morning. It's the 11th of April today, and today we have Ahmed present a paper to us. I do apologize for my mix-up. I was sick the last 2 weeks, so my head was not really getting appointments in the right order. But today he's back and he's going to present a paper to us. Just a quick reminder about the rules. Everyone is welcome to come and join us, present a paper, a book chapter, a video, any piece of exciting science is acceptable. 11th of April today.
Yep, sorry.
Someone has an echo. Just on neuroscience, because we all know we find our own science tremendously exciting. So we're avoiding that bias. Right, without further ado, Ahmed, if you want to share your screen, share the link in the chat, we can make a start. Great. There is. You seem to have a slide.
Good morning,
everyone. Here.
I hope that the link is okay for everyone to find the paper. So the paper I'm presenting today is this one. It's unfortunately not going to contain any brain pictures, but it's more of a neuropsych or behavioral results paper. But the title struck me when I saw the paper initially. Seeing that we all use GPS, I guess if I just take a show of hands now of who uses GPS, I think it will be probably 100% of the audience today. So with that in mind, I'm interested generally in the visual spatial study of and within the brain. So when I saw this paper, I was intrigued and thought, okay, let's look at this in more detail. So basically, just the background. For anyone who's not really familiar with this side of the brain or how the brain processes visual space. So we have two systems that we usually talk about when it comes to visual space, one and navigating the space around us. So two navigation strategies here in this paper. One is the spatial memory strategy, and the other is the stimulus response strategy. So these two are presented here to mean in one case, the spatial memory strategy is when you really form a map of the environment. So this is when someone really knows an area so well that they can actually draw a map of it if you want. They can tell you where things are relative to each other. Whereas the stimulus response strategy when you're navigating a space is about how you navigate the space relative to your own body position. So you're moving in a space, you see some stimulus, you know how to respond to that stimulus, but you need to be there to know how to respond to it, right? So this is about you just not necessarily forming a map of the environment, but just moving in that environment and responding to a stimulus when it appears. So landmarks, turn left at the bank, turn right at the bakery, and so on and so forth. So with these two things in mind, and we know that they rely on different systems within the brain, or at least they engage different cortical areas to different extents. So the question is, of course, GPS doesn't require you to form a map of anything, right? In GPS, you can simply follow instructions without thinking too much about it. So the question is, would that sort of quote unquote, blindly following instructions with GPS, not having to think about the cortical environment, not having to switch too much between this representation of the environment within relative to your own body or the representation of the environment in a map-like structure, would that in itself lead to a change in behavior over time that is indicative that you are now sort of losing some of your spatial abilities in navigation? So in the study they recruited 50 participants, and this was done in Canada. And they had a good balance, more or less, within the sample, the ultimate sample of sex balance. They did multiple tasks on. There's a cross-sectional study, but there's also a longitudinal study. So I'll just talk about the first here. First, the tasks that they did, for example, they did two main tasks. One is the spatial discrimination task, the CSDLT, the concurrent spatial discrimination learning task. Actually, I'll just show them here. So they did two tasks. The first is represented in the top row. So in this one, there's a stage of learning and a stage, or the probe stage. So in the learning stage, it's a radial maze. Participants would have to learn the positions of sort of several objects within the maze. And this happens in pairs. So at every trial, let's say, they're presented with a pair of these paths in the maze that you can see up there. And then they are presented with another pair of paths and another pair of paths and another pair of paths. And you see examples here. It's like 1 and 2, 3 and 4, and so on and so forth. But only in one of them is there an object of interest that they need to retrieve. And you can see that in the back there, there's a landscape that they can see. So they can have this representation of knowing where things are relative to other things in the environment, and so on and so forth. So once they learn all of this, then there's a probe stage. And in stage 2, what happens is the initial pairs are no longer the same. So for example, if initially I could see path 1 plus 2, now I could see maybe path 2 and 3. So the initial pairings are changed. And the idea here is you can no longer rely on knowing a simple, like knowing one path to figure out what's in the other one. You have to have some type of either forming a map of the environment or knowing how to respond to the background stimuli. And the task in this case, in the probe stage, would be to find certain objects again, as you did in the first one, but this time with the pairs being changed. And the second task is something similar as well, but the difference is it's similar to kind of like some tasks that are used with rodent studies as well. So it's again another radial maze with paths. Some of them are blocked and some of them are not blocked. And participants will have to again learn this whole where objects are in this maze by in which paths. Again, there's a background that they can see and so on. The difference is in the probe stage. In this one, the background is masked so that participants can no longer really rely on the background information to know where things are, and they would have to have had some other representation, some kind of stimulus response representation within the maze itself. So these are the two major tasks that they used, but they also did a bunch of other assessments. One of them is a GPS questionnaire. So this is assessing how reliant subjects are on the use of GPS overall, and assesses their lifetime use of GPS. So that's kind of trying to hit at an estimate of how much do people use GPS overall in their lifetime in terms of hours, weekly, and so on and so forth. They also did other neuropsychological tests. So the Ray auditory verbal learning task, the Ray complex figure task, the sense of direction scale, and so on. All of them trying to establish for each of these top subjects what is the, let's say, overall picture of visual spatial ability and spatial thinking or reasoning. So the first round of results is that basically there isn't so much association, and if we just take a cross section of the population between things like GPS reliance and I'm actually not showing it here. Let me show it to the next figure. Yes. If we just look at this, the spatial task results and so on, there are some, relationships that they found between performance on certain tasks and lifetime GPS use and so on, but all of them were, weak and some marginally significant and so on. And they go into a whole bunch of discussions about how the initial cross-sectional results or just sort of snapshot results don't show that there's initial high reliance or high dependence on the strategies you use in a clear way between your own abilities and these strategies. Although these relationships exist, they're in general not so striking, let's say. But for me, the most interesting result in this whole study was the second part, which is the longitudinal study. So the longitudinal study is they had a smaller part of the cohort come back for a second assessment. I think it was 3 years after the initial one. And in this case, they repeated everything they'd done initially. So now they have a change in, so they have the sort of the change value for their performance on these tasks, but also relative to the initial performance on that they had and relative to their own visual spatial abilities and GPS reliance and so on. And this to me was the more striking part of the study. So here on the x-axis, for example, on this one, they're showing the hours of GPS use since pre-test. So they're trying to plot how much change there was in their use of GPS over time since the initial stage. And on the y-axis, for example, they're showing the their ability to perform that initial task of changing the pairings between initial maze or the radial maze arms. And you can see a very striking negative relationship here, where the more GPS you use between first time point and the second time point of the study, the worse your performance was on the task. And this is very strong correlation here, I would say, just in neuropsych terms. And they saw that there was this kind of relationship on several of these measures, GPS reliance on, and the relationship to both tasks, the initial one and the second one. So to me, that sort of, I never expected to find something that strong as a correlation in these kinds of studies, but just seeing them, these plots here made me really think like, oh, am I using GPS too much? Am I frying my brain doing that? And so this is in general the main finding that I think is worth looking into in more detail in this paper. They go into discussion saying how the initial that this cannot simply be attributed to the participants' initial preference for using GPS or their initial visual spatial abilities per se, but it's really, they tie the findings to a change in GPS use over time, because some of the findings they say are not necessarily predictable in the performance-wise, not in a strong way by any of the neuropsych measures that they initially used, but it was only when they see the change over time and the longitudinal arm of the study that they see this really high ability to predict results in this regression analysis. So that's the paper for you there. If I wonder if people have questions on this topic in general, or like, I think it's worth having a discussion in general on this topic at this point.
Great, thank you. Wow, first hands are up. Victor.
Hi, thank you for the paper. It was really interesting and kind of frightening when you think about it.
Yeah, that was my reaction.
Yeah, but I was wondering, because from personal experience, like I use GPS, not that often, but still. But when I use GPS, I see that I have at least 2 different kind of strategies using them. Either I am in a completely unknown environment, and I don't have time to look at the map and everything, and I follow blindly the GPS.
Yeah.
And that I can expect, if I do that all the time, that would result in maybe the outcome that you show on the paper. But there is also the times where I just want to know where I am, but I already have a mental map of the area. And so I can just pinpoint where I am, but I still have the good thing. And I think these are 2 different things. And
absolutely, yeah. So what you just described is using the 2 different strategies, right? So in the first case, you described this kind of stimulus response strategy. So you walk until you hit a landmark or a point at which you need to respond in a certain way, and you follow that response and then move on to the next one. And that does not need you to have any idea sort of from a top view of the map of the environment, right? You can just be completely unaware of it and you're still going to arrive to your destination. But in the second one you're describing, you have a rough idea where you are, you have a rough idea of the whole environment. And with even then, you still maybe want to be more certain about your location. And these are in some cases referred to as the egocentric and allocentric representations of space. So the egocentric representation is all about, where are things relative to me right now? So this is really necessary to be able to respond to a stimulus in your environment and follow directions and landmarks. The other one is the allocentric space, in which case things are referenced relative to each other in space, but not relative to me. So this is when I have a map. And there's, the visual space or spatial navigation in brain is reliant on a large network, but importantly, the egocentric and egocentric relies a lot on the parietal lobe in a way in responding to these things, but the allocentric relies a lot on the hippocampal circuitry as well in forming these cognitive maps of space. So not only are they sort of separated in a way at the brain level, but also I think they might have longitudinal effects, or longitudinally they might experience different things like growth or development and degeneration.
Thank you. And I might have missed it because at the start of your talk, I was trying to setting things up and stuff like that. So, but have you tested? Was it, for the paper? Was it tested the difference in orientation abilities from different people and stuff like that? Because it's very viable.
So they did this, they did multiple tests, including the, for example, general visual spatial abilities, like the ray figure test, the ray auditory learning test, and so on. And they also did the GPS dependence questionnaire, and they did I'll tell you what it's called, the Santa Barbara spatial dependence test or something like that. I'll just try to remember the task. Yeah, the Santa Barbara sense of direction scale. So they actually tested on these metrics to try and assess, basically, in the first hand of the study before the longitudinal arm, if you take sense of direction in general on that scale, will that be enough to predict your performance in a good way? And they found that there's some link, but it's not as striking as you would expect. And it was only the change over time in use in the longitudinal arm that really reflected the bigger sort of predictive power. And then this is the interpretation here is that it's not just your initial sort of where you are, where's your baseline initially that can explain all of this and how your longitudinal trajectory would look like. It's really your increase or decrease in the use of GPS that explains how your longitudinal trajectory looks like.
Thank you.
Valentina has a question as well.
Hi. My question is, so this is it's scary paper, like it doesn't play well in terms of our cognitive abilities and our relationship with Google Maps or any GPS. But can we gain something from the GPS? So in terms of the strategies that you were talking about, so can we improve our ability in using one strategy than another by using the GPS? I know it's beyond the scope of the paper you presented, but
so when I think about it, so I was thinking about this question in a way, in a slightly different way. I was thinking perhaps one strategy I would like to follow now myself, for example, from now on, is if I'm learning a new environment and it's completely new and I need to get to a new, workplace or whatever it is. From my view, I'll try to, the first once maybe, use GPS just to be able to get there. And then a few times later, try not to use GPS, especially in the early stages of learning the environment, not later after having used it, for example, 20, 30 times already on GPS and then stop depending on it. So in a way, try exploring more. That's my strategy from now on, I guess, based on these results. But try and explore more and try to learn the environment in a bit of a way that allows me, or forces me, not allows me, even forces me to try and really form a map of where I am and learn absorb where things are, really, really process them. Now, the other way around is what you're pointing to is using GPS. If using GPS more in itself is sort of beneficial in any way, I don't know if that would be the case, because what we're seeing here is if you use GPS more, what you're doing is just relying more on a stimulus response strategy, which could be useful if you if all you need to do is respond to stimuli in your environment to be able to get to somewhere new. And you don't really need a map in that case. For example, in the test that they did, the second test that they did, where they, after learning the initial pairings and so on, they then mask all the landscape around the maze. So in a way, if you perform better on that one, you really need to perform best on pairing things together and, relative to where they were last time and so on. It's not really about just learning a strategy about the whole environment around you. Maybe that might be a better, useful in that situation. But I don't know in general in life, in real life, how beneficial that would be beyond the scope of specifically navigating, because I think the repercussions of it in outside of navigation for us using GPS less would probably be to improve our hippocampal circuitry, and it might even have some effects on neurogenesis in the hippocampus. This is completely like shooting in the dark, but I think these are all possibly important implications in the future. I guess questions to be investigated.
Yeah. No, I was rather thinking of complementary cognitive abilities. For instance, to me, it's not simple to use a GPS sometimes because it requires. I was actually thinking not the arrow. In Google Maps, you have the arrow that points you toward this. I was thinking more the passive view of the point to the dot that you're moving in them. And that is quite difficult to use, and it requires a lot of spatial rotation, orientation, a lot of it. So I was thinking maybe I'm improving in spatial orientation rather than not using the GPS.
Yeah, actually, I think this is a good point, probably, because it's like when you see someone on their phone trying to just figure out which way am I going.
That's me.
I think in the initial, that's true, probably, because this will need to engage some reorienting and initial sort of local mapping of I see a point on the map, but where is it relative to me now? So you have to switch between this map representation you see in front of you and your own local environment to start your journey. And then once you're on your way, you rely less on that sort of ongoing transformation, and just then you can start blindly following. But that initial one probably needs a lot of that switching. Which is going medial temporal to parietal to medial temporal to parietal.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely,
So I guess my connections are firing.
Yeah, going all over the place.
When I'm in a new environment. Yeah, thank you.
Part of that might also be your phone. For those of you who don't know, it's hard to get hold of phones, Right, Leah also has a question.
Yes, I was thinking of how can we train our brain then if now we really depend on GPS or this new technology? And I was thinking virtual reality, like the task that you show, can train our visual spatial abilities, or it's going in the GPS direction, or maybe it's a more active task. But I don't know, I was just wondering.
It's a very difficult question, I think. I think this is actually, because it's pointing to a very important thing it's difficult to address, I think, in our studies in general, which is the following. When you're navigating the environment, right, you're not only relying on your visual inputs to figure things out, but there's locomotor input to the brain, right? So you're moving physically through the environment, and there's that idea of path integration, which is basically when you're moving through the environment, this motor task that you're performing of moving through it is also contributing to how you learn that space, because that motor mapping is also contributing to all of it. So the idea is, when we're doing all of these in simple visual form, sitting in a chair, not moving at all, is that really engaging the full circuitry? And perhaps when you are to perform a task with some locomotor element to it, maybe that changes things a little bit as well. I don't really know the answer to that, I'm afraid, but I think, more ecologically valid studies in the future will be very important to address this. The nice thing about this one here, of course, is that they didn't do any imaging or force people. I mean, they did the task in a chair, fine, but they also use the real life measures that people are actually doing,
that is great. Yeah.
So they link the two in a way, but yeah, I don't know how full our picture and understanding is of all of these things in the human brain, at least, because we always just do things sitting in a chair in these tasks, and I think it's similar, but it's really not the same.
Okay, thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Chris has a question.
Hey, to kind of continue the discussion that Leah started. So about staying in a chair first, when you're in your car, you're staying in a chair. So can you actually train? Also, I'm thinking of what Leah said about virtual reality, but also in video games in general, because there is a lot. Some video games need you to find places in the environment to see where you are on a map, and then you have to navigate. And could you train with that? And so it makes me think that it might not be that much linked to the motor. So I don't know the studies about the motor, the relationship between motor and navigation, but I know that there are some studies showing that video games can improve some aspects of memory, and especially spatial memory, I think, can be improved with video games.
So I think what you're describing is a great example, actually, of this idea of having to sort of, also going back to the point that we were raising with Valentina, is that having to switch so much between that sort of what I see. If we factor out all the motor stuff and all the vestibular system activations and all their involvement, that there's, you're just having to link something purely visual with local representation of the environment to a map representation, and that is engaging a lot of that circuitry so much that we don't engage when we're simply relying on GPS blindly. So I think what you're pointing to is really yes, maybe we can use these things, video games or virtual reality in general, to actually counter the effects of GPS, for example, by forcing someone to switch strategies in an environment, or engaging in a way that, okay, you can use GPS the first time you go around, and then the second time you have to just explore and find your way around and then draw a map of the environment. I think it's just, if we engage more in that map representation, that rather than simply relying on stimulus response strategies, that I think will help us maybe avoid this kind of decline in spatial abilities over time. So I think it's maybe a very nice strategy to follow GPS in real life and then go and play games, video games, to kind of counter the effect. Maybe that works. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe you can counteract the effect with it.
Yeah. It's probably worth doing a study on this. In a longitudinal study where one part of the participant pool is actually engaging in these video games that require this kind of switching constantly, despite them using GPS more, and the other is not. And then can we find then that this counters the effect in any way? I think that would be a really cool question.
That would be a great project. And if you add neuroimaging to that, that would be
fantastic.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Careful, because in video games, very often you've got the minimap, and the minimap is essentially a GPS, right?
That's
it. Yeah, but the minimap is like, so you never have roads in video games, pretty much. So you can't use and the minimap is not often, in some video games it gives you a path, but it's still just but in most video games it's just a map, and you have your position in it, so you don't have a direct path to where you want to go. And I think that's the problem of GPS, because it's just removing all the feedback that you need to have between the map, your environment. You're just following what the GPS tells you. But in video games, it's rarely the case. You don't have a voice telling you turn left after the tree.
I think even to push it a bit more, I think the important bit is to try and do it without any map representation. So force your own brain to create that map representation instead of getting it from the outside, because I think this is the real important bit, is going from that fully self-centered representation of visual space to a complete map representation, but completely sort of made by you as you go along to try and update that map, not relying on an external one. I think that even takes it a bit further. Yeah.
Loving the discussion this morning. I'm up for in a couple of questions. The first one is if you've seen the paper that just came out in one of the Nature journals about how your spatial navigation and visual spatial memory is different whether you grew up in the city or in the countryside. And I think the gist was that the big cities are planned in grids to make navigation easy, but that actually is quite detrimental or harmful to your spatial skills. And I was wondering how that would factor into the study.
Actually, you should send me that paper because I haven't seen it.
In the chat.
Okay, great, thanks.
Not Bordeaux like train you. It's all
I was thinking, was this London either? I'm not sure. Maybe New York or something. I don't know how much that would impact as well, because I think what you're saying is yeah, if you grew up in a city where it's mainly grid representation, you probably don't need to rely anyway on such big map representations of the environment, because even if you don't have GPS, you can still follow a GPS-like strategy, because if it's a grid, just keep walking in a straight line until I hit one landmark and then take either left or right and then so on and so forth. So it's much less intensive or has lower requirements overall. So I think it's more, maybe that's kind of in between following strict GPS and full map representations. But if I were to go around, for example, in London without GPS, it's a mess really. Initially, if I'm trying to find a new place without GPS here, it'll take me ages more, because everything's going around in curves, and then I can no longer use that grid representation. So it's probably it's probably because that grid allows you to form a sort of rely on that stimulus response strategy and doesn't necessitate the map. So yeah, that's my understanding, prediction, I guess.
Thank you. Then I have two more questions, just very briefly. So the stimuli you showed in the paper, in one of the figures, they look quite boxy and like not naturalistic. So I was wondering if you had an idea on how to actually conduct this experiment in an ecologically viable environment that is then quite reliable because it's a naturalistic scene.
You know, this is something that I always thought about when reading visual spatial imaging literature, or just in this kind of literature in general, because all of the virtual environments that are used in these studies are in a way like very, very badly made games. That's how they look, right? But I think now maybe the future of this kind of research is, I don't know, collaboration between gaming industry and neuroscience, because games are insanely realistic at this point in time. And the fact that we're still using, I don't know, 30-year-old looking representations in research is kind of maybe detrimental to the findings. So I think the future should involve some type of collaboration between the gaming industry and neuroscience. I don't think there's any way around it, because these things are extremely difficult, of course, to design. So I think, one person will not be enough for it. You need a proper team working on just the one task. And that's probably the resources I don't think we have in academia.
I'm just highlighting to the resources in the room. We have at least 2 gamers. We have at least 1 software engineer.
Right.
And you guys already pitched an idea for a project. So maybe you just group, team up and write that grant. And
any ecologically valid tests coming your way.
Yes. That would be quite a success story for Neuroccino. And then the final point I had is about VR. So I have a headset here and I love using it, but there's a certain time limit I can use it until my head gets a bit fuzzy. So there's still a difference between like being in the virtual reality and being out in the street. But I also recently had the discussion with someone who tried to implement VR in their grants and get the feedback that this is not going anywhere and we don't need virtual reality in research. So very crudely relaying the information I was given. So I was wondering how you see it going forward, if VR is actually a useful tool, what the limitations could be, how it actually fits, and especially for visual spatial navigation research.
Yeah, I think this is a very important question. It kind of sort of touches on that thing we talked about earlier about, using these computer tasks for navigation versus using the actual thing. And is there a difference? Is it really ecologically valid and so on? But even going further, I will mention one important limitation that usually affects most imaging studies and psychological studies conducted in labs, which is how much of your visual space you're stimulating. So in all of these things, you're usually looking at a computer screen, so you're really stimulating maybe at best the central 30 degrees of visual space or something like that. And if I were to just look at my visual field from sort of the midline all the way to one side in the periphery, it extends roughly to 100 degrees on the extremity, right? So that's how much of my visual space I can see coming through my retina. I'm always in testing and psychological studies, we're looking at this really cone limited visual space on the screen. So the question is, how much is the periphery contributing? How important is this? Are we ignoring so much of how the brain really functions in the outside world when we're simply just looking at the center of the screen in these computer tasks? So I think this is where virtual reality comes in, because it probably immerses you in a way that really your entire visual field is being stimulated, or at least so much more of it. So it probably helps overcome this step, but then it starts highlighting an issue that you pointed out, which is you do it for a bit and then you start getting dizzy. And it's probably because you are in this immersive environment in which you're completely moving at a certain speed in a certain direction, but then your vestibular system is like, nope, I'm just here, right? So there's that mismatch now between the vestibular input and your visual input. And I think that in itself then starts launching you into a whole different dimension of sensory mismatch rather than doing something, like ecologically valid. So it poses its own challenges. And this is where the locomotion comes in, I think, to become, you need for the full picture to be there, you really need something where you can also not just move your legs, but also be launched in the environment in a way that causes acceleration to your vestibular system that we're just, I think, almost impossible to get if you're just in a lab.
Yeah, I just recently moved on a houseboat and I haven't dared putting on the headset yet because I'm constantly moving anyway, so my head is dizzy all the time by not doing anything. So that's going to be the next level here. But yeah, so coming back to the VR challenge accepted. You're welcome to come and try it out.
Yeah, that's a good project.
But yeah, so the other thing that about the VR and visual spatial navigation, I think that's quite interesting, is that I wouldn't be surprised if we discover new phenomena. So things like the rubber hand, for example, where it's not your hand, but if someone threatens the fake arm, you withdraw your hand because you embody it. With the VR headset, for example, you walk around and then the laws of gravity and everything is like it's messing with your head because the visual input just doesn't obey by physical rules.
Yes.
So for example, you would walk and suddenly there's no more floor under you. And even though you're standing on solid ground, you feel like, whoa, what's going on? And even for someone who's not scared of heights, I get this rush of like physical reaction to it, visceral. It's like, whoa, this is not good, until I remind myself, it's like, no, it's so good. I'm just standing in my living room. So I think that there might be potential to discover some new exciting phenomena that we don't even know about just yet. So yeah, I think it's super exciting.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think also it's very funny. I find it really funny when I see these videos of someone with a VR headset on, and then they're in this scary environment and someone just gives them a tiny push and then they really freak out because they think they're falling off somewhere. I think these are really messing with our, this is a great example of how you're standing on solid ground. Your body knows it, right? Physically, it knows it. Your vestibular system knows it. But then because the visual input to our brain is so crucial and important, it can take over all of the others in a way and really make you think you're falling off a cliff or something. And then people just freak out. I think they're funny, but potentially not just funny, but very informative maybe for our research. Yeah.
If I can just add something about the video games, I think we very underestimate how our brain can be tricked by video games, even by traditional video games, because I'm sure that we all had this experience or saw someone playing a racing video game and they are turning on their seat. Like, why would you do that if you were not actually thinking that you were racing yourself and not on your couch? And I had reactions like in normal video games. So I see the screen and the limits of the screen, and my character, it's not even a first person view. My character is falling and I feel my body tighten and I'm like, yeah. I mean, we are completely tricked by virtual environments. And I think there is such an insane potential for research with that.
It also reminds you how we're not that smart.
No, definitely.
Yeah.
Another thing that's going to be exciting is going to be remote access to VR. So you don't have to physically travel anymore to the research site. You can just put on your headset and you're part of the study, no matter where you are.
Oh, that's such a good idea. I didn't even think about it, but yeah, you could ask people who own a VR headset to participate to a study.
Yeah,
so good.
This is actually really cool. Yeah, you suddenly have a global participant pool. It's it's awesome.
Still in a few years for everyone to get a VR headset, but it's coming.
It's coming.
And compatibility issues, la-di-da-di-da, but you need a vision. There you go.
Yeah. I think, are you spearheading the movement of virtual recruitment now?
I could do the recruitment. You guys need to do the visualization. Great. I think this is all we have time for today. Thanks for the great paper and the wonderful discussion. I greatly enjoyed it today.
Yeah, thank you.
Heads up, next Monday there is no Neuroccino because we are taking an Easter break, but we'll be back the week after. As always, if anyone reads some piece of exciting science or wants to read the study that we just discussed as a follow-up, just let me know, and everyone's welcome to present. With that, have an exciting week in science. Have a lovely break for those of you who take it. Thanks for presenting, Ahmed, and see you soon. Bye.
Bye, everyone.